Welcome back to another episode of Podcast on the Brink for the second straight week. Tyler Tachman, who is back from the Bahamas, he is back in Bloomington. Tyler, you've been a busy man on a lot of airplanes the last couple of days. So tell us where you've been. You were obviously at the game Sunday afternoon. Now you're back in Bloomington. How did you make it? How'd you make that happen so quickly?
Man, not magic, that's for sure. I went from the Bahamas on Monday, flew to Charlotte, then Monday night and had a little 2-hour delay. Then back to Raleigh, came home for about 12 hours, went back to the Raleigh-Durham airport, then back to Charlotte, which was my third time in 7 days there. So then from there to Indianapolis, and now back in Bloomington.
Yeah, you'll start covering football full speed ahead tomorrow. But before you get into football coverage, wanted to take the time, since you were down in the Bahamas, to have you back on the show. We previewed the trip last week, and now that the trip's over with, just big picture, what were your takeaways from being down there and getting a chance to watch Indiana play a couple exhibition games?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I kind of just, before I talk about it, I kind of want to put the disclaimer that it was only 2 games. It was a very small sample size. So, I don't think that it was definitely some moves in the right direction, but I don't think that necessarily you can conclude that Indiana is going to be going to the Elite Eight or Final Four or anything off of these 2 games. But it was a very promising sign. I think that you couldn't have really asked for 2 better games than Indiana gave, considering that Mike Woodson has only been working with them for about 2 months. A lot of the guys, they have 5 new guys coming in, and just as a team, they haven't been playing together a whole lot. But I think that they were about as impressive as you could have possibly asked for. I thought the defense, which Mike Woodson had emphasized was a real focus in the offseason, looked much more consistent. And some of the rotations I was really impressed with. And BC Mega did not shoot very well at all, in part to the defense. But, overall, just 2 double-digit wins, and Indiana really dominated all 80 minutes. So I don't think that if you're an Indiana fan, if you're Mike Woodson, if you're anybody on the team, you could have really asked for a better 2 games down there.
What was your impression of just the Atlantis resort? I'm assuming it was your first time there. What was the atmosphere like down there? From the pictures and all the video I saw, it seemed like it was a great experience. But what was there anything like besides the basketball that really stood out to you that you got a chance to do while you're down there?
Am I allowed to talk about my gambling, or are we trying to keep this G-rated?
No, go ahead.
That's actually one thing I was kind of excited for, because my grandparents used to live in Las Vegas. So every summer I go to Las Vegas. I grew up kind of wandering around the Gold Coast and Rio and Bellagio, all the different casinos and hotels there. So that's something that I had really looked forward to, because the gambling age there is 18. So spent some time on the slots. I actually hit a $70 jackpot off of a $1 play. And a couple hands later, I had another one. So I was up like $150 on $20. That was the biggest I had hit while I was down there. And then I played one hand of roulette. It was a $15 minimum. Lost it instantly, and I was like, okay, that's enough. Like I had walked away immediately. I was like, that's enough for me. But that was kind of fun to do that, and the overall atmosphere. There was just it was pretty crowded. There's a lot of people, a lot of movement. The views with the beach, I posted a picture from that, and it was really nice. And just I think kind of the most fun for me was just for covering the team last year all remotely, just being in the same area as the players and their families and the coaches, being able to interact with them at just a closer level than really I've been able to cover the team since I've been on the beat. So I think just kind of the atmosphere and being able to interact more with the players in the community was probably one of the best parts.
So for this episode, one thing we did was I went into our our community that we have at Inside the Hall, members.insidethehall.com, and I opened it up. You've been pretty active in there, answering questions and responding to people, but I opened it up to our members there and asked them if they had questions for you about the trip. And so I'm not sure we'll be able to get to every question. I'm kind of scanning through some of them here, and we'll kind of bounce around a little bit. But the first one that stands out, and this is from Wine Country Mark. He asks, I think this is a pretty good starting point to maybe just get this out of the way. Was BC Mega overrated? He wants to know.
I mean, from what we knew going in, I mean, they're a top tier team in Serbia, and kind of had all the makings of a team that you think would really be able to challenge Indiana. And I mean, I remember sitting before the first game watching them warm up, and I was like, they're going to give Indiana trouble. But they just had a lot of length. They just looked focused, and I was kind of shocked of how flat they came out. Both games, it was clear that Indiana was the more poised team. They had more energy. They were more together. Mega they just looked flat. They just looked like they didn't have a lot of energy. And if you wouldn't have told me that Nikola Jovic was a projected top 10 or lottery pick, I would have had no idea. I mean, he just looked like any other player on the court. He was not very aggressive at all. He just kind of blended in with everyone else. So, I mean, from what I saw, I was not impressed at all with BC Mega. I don't know if they had an off weekend, if they were at the casino till 2 a.m. or what happened. But yeah, I was not extremely impressed with them overall.
Follow up from Mark. He mentioned that other than Tamar Bates and Miller Kopp, nobody shot the ball particularly well. Did you attribute that to defense or just poor shooting or a combination of both? I think I noticed one thing that stood out to me from the Sunday box score was Xavier Johnson was, I think, 4 of 15 from the field. What do you attribute just the overall poor shooting numbers for Indiana on the trip, with the exception of a few guys?
I mean, I think it a little bit of it had to do with Mega's length. They kind of had an obvious size advantage, especially with Durr and Duncombe out. So I think that the length of Mega played a little bit of a role in that. But like Mike Woodson said after the second game, there was a lot of open looks that Indiana had that just didn't go down. And I know that's probably not what fans want to hear after the last couple of seasons, but a lot of them were good looks. Most of them looked good. They were good shots, and they just didn't drop. I think there was maybe one possession I can remember that Xavier Johnson may have pulled the trigger on a maybe 15-footer without any passes in the possession that, looking back, probably you wouldn't want. But I think for the most part, they were good shots. They were in rhythm, and some of them just didn't go down.
Hoosier Jake wants to know which player were impressed by or surprised by, and why.
I think I wrote about Jordan Geronimo. I think that he is one that you could tell just between his poise and kind of confidence that he's made strides from last season. And he's a guy that hasn't played a whole lot of basketball. He was an underrated recruit for most of his time in high school, and didn't really necessarily know he wanted to play college basketball for up to a certain point in high school. So I think that last year was a really good learning experience for him. And one play that stuck out to me was in the first game, and he was open at the top of the key. I wrote about this too, but he yelled like pretty loudly that he wanted the ball. He demanded it. And I think that's something that he maybe wouldn't have done last year. He just more assertive, and that was echoed by Race Thompson when I was talking to him, and Trace Jackson Davis, and Xavier Johnson was actually asked about who was maybe an under the radar guy that he had been impressed by, and he also said Jordan Geronimo. So I think he was one guy. One thing I'll say that maybe didn't even have the best week down or best 2 games down there was Parker Stewart. He didn't shoot the ball at the clip that we've seen in his time at Pitt and UT Martin. But I was very impressed with his physicality. He's a big guy, 6'5". It's the first time I've seen him play in person, obviously, because he was sitting out all last season. We just saw him in street clothes. But he's a very physical guard. He was extremely active on the defensive end, getting in passing lanes. He took charges. He just had a lot of energy, and he didn't shoot the ball as well, but I could easily see him being a very effective 3-and-D guy for Indiana, bringing a lot of intensity on defense. I almost kind of compared him to an Armand Franklin that couldn't put the ball on the deck as much, but the same kind of two-way skill set that could be really good for Indiana.
Cincy Hoosier with an interesting question here that I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts. What were your observations, initial takeaways from seeing Mike Woodson up close and on the sidelines coaching?
Yeah, I think overall he just has a very calm demeanor, which reflects what we've seen in press conferences and kind of his overall interactions, but also that he's not afraid to get in guys' grill if needed. There was a couple of times that screens weren't executed the right way, and it was obvious he wasn't happy, and he let I think it was Trace know about it. So I think that he's not afraid at all to light a fire up someone if need be, or tell them exactly what he's thinking. I think that's one thing that, talking to Logan Duncombe coming into Indiana, he said, that's one thing the guys appreciate about him, is that he's not going to BS them. He's going to tell them exactly how he's feeling. And I think overall on the court, he's very calm, but also he's much willing to just speak his mind if that's what's needed.
And this just kind of my observation, and let me know if you agree. Just watching him in the post-game press conferences, although they were brief, I mean, he showed more charisma and more just kind of being relaxed and in the moment in those 5 to 10 minutes. And I think we saw from Archie Miller over 4 seasons. Would you agree with that? And does it seem like, once we get into the meat of the season, it seems like he's going to be a pretty good soundbite and a guy that's willing to kind of give his unfiltered opinions on what he sees on a game-to-game basis? Yeah,
I think one of the funny things was looking back at his press conference before the Bahamas, that he was completely honest with how he was seeing things. He said Tamar Bates was a little light in the butt, and he said he gained 12 pounds, so he said it was good for him. But he was saying, he said Parker Stewart had been one of the better players, and then he wasn't playing well, and he was trying to get him to get back to that level. So I think he's, whether it be with the media, whether it be with those players, with the fans, he's going to say how he's feeling, and he doesn't, necessarily care how it's perceived. And that's not a bad thing in terms of him just spewing all different crazy type of stuff, but just in terms of he's going to say it as it is. And I think that's kind of beneficial because, over the last season or so, there maybe been a little beating around that exact point of what's going on. And I think he's going to tell it exactly how he sees it.
So Jim Bernstein has a couple questions. I want to get to both of these. And the first one, I don't know that you're going to have a great answer for, because I think all of us are kind of wondering this. And it was one thing that really stood out to me just from following on live stats and your updates on Twitter. But Jim wants to know, aside from having 2 experienced point guards in front of him, what other possible reasons are there for so little playing time for Christian Lander? And I'll say, and you can chime in after this, but I think it's a pretty strong indicator of kind of where Lander is right now, that he was basically the 10th man off the in the rotation, and there was only 10 scholarship players available down there. I don't necessarily think it was all that promising in terms of his minutes, but what were your thoughts on just kind of watching them play and maybe where he fits? And then getting back to Jim's question, what do you think the reasons are maybe that he got so few minutes down there at the Bahamas?
I will say this, from the entirety of the trip that I was able to watch him, I was really impressed by his poise, how vocal he was in his leadership. I mean, just looking back from last year, he seemed like he had kind of turned it on another gear. I was kind of surprised how little minutes he played, and I mean, there's not a worse time for him to make mistakes than there would have been in these couple exhibition games. So it leaves me, scratching my head a little bit why he wasn't getting more minutes. And there's obviously maybe something that Mike Woodson saw that he wasn't pleased with. But from what I saw the entire trip, I was very impressed with his leadership, with how he commanded the court. He seemed very poised, and his shot was, from what I saw, not very consistent. But just his overall demeanor, I was really impressed with. He seemed like a guy that was ready to step in and to be a floor general. So, I mean, I was, from that regard, I was very, very impressed from him. As for the 10, I guess, minutes overall he played, I think he scored 4 baskets. Maybe he made a couple of nice moves in the lane. For the time that he was in there, he did a good job. He didn't really get much opportunity at all to see any meaningful minutes. So I think that it's definitely kind of an interesting situation to track as the season gets closer. And as far as I know, there was no injury problem. So I don't think that's an issue for why he wasn't playing.
Yeah, I mean, it is important to note too that he would, if he hadn't reclassed, he would just be entering his freshman season. So I think it's going to come down to whether or not, he's willing to be patient and kind of take his time and go through the process, because it's clear that he's the third guy right now at the point guard position. They didn't bring in Xavier Johnson to ride the bench. Obviously, he's going to have a big role. And Rob Finney's an experienced guy that's kind of been through the rigors of the Big Ten so many times and is a really good defender when he's playing well. So it makes sense. But I do understand why fans are curious about him. But I think it's, the one thing I do see that's a positive maybe about this weaker pre-conference schedule for Indiana is that some of the younger players may get a chance to play more minutes than what we saw last year, where it was condensed and there was really only those 2 guarantee games. This year, there's probably going to be 7 or 8 games where Indiana's in pretty complete control for a long time, and they're going to be able to give some of their younger players more opportunity. And Christian Lander definitely falls within that category. Jim's second question, he asks, when Woodson convinced Trace to return for his junior season, one of the critiques he had of Trace was his inability to use his offhand and extend his shooting range. Was there any evidence of progress on either of those fronts?
I mean, I wouldn't say from the 2-game sample I was necessarily struck by either one of those things. I think a lot of what we saw was just similar to what we had seen last year. I mean, he was just a dominant player, finishing around the rim, explosiveness. He ran the floor well. He made some good moves down low. There was a couple times in the first game that I remember him making strong moves over his left shoulder using his right hand. I can't remember if the shot went down, but it was he made very decisive moves over that shoulder. And I believe he took one shot from close to 3-point range, if not behind the line. I think it bounced off the rim, didn't go in. I mean, it looked fine. I wouldn't, necessarily come out of these 2 games saying that he has undoubtedly developed his right hand and jump shot. And again, it's been 2 months since Mike Woodson took over, so there's more room for growth. And I don't even think that really he has much needed to. Indiana didn't need him to step out. I think one of the things that impressed me about their offense was that it was just a lot of quick movements. There wasn't, if he was out on the perimeter, he'd be out there for a couple of seconds, then back inside the paint, then he'd move out. There was a lot of off-ball screens. So my worries about the lane being clogged, I think, were kind of subsided, just because if he was in the lane, it wasn't for too long unless he was trying to post up. So I think that's possibly what can really make the offense work well, is just because it's just constant movement. It's a lot of off-ball screens. It's guys coming to the top of the key to set screens and rolling. So I think, Indiana didn't really need all that versatility from Trace Jackson Davis in these 2 games, but it's certainly something that as he tries to make the jump to the next level will obviously be very important.
One question that just came to mind I was thinking about that I have, A lot of people have asked me obviously, your dad, thankfully, was able to step in on the camera and film these games for us because of where you were sitting. You weren't able to use that angle for camera. They wanted somebody to be on the baseline. So, long time Indiana SID JD Campbell came through, and your dad was willing to sit down there on the baseline and film the games for him. But for us, but people have asked me on Twitter and different places on the community, like what I thought going back and watching the film of the games. And the vantage point wasn't necessarily the best to try to watch and see things because when he was filming, obviously he was down on the end where Indiana was playing offense. And so one thing I'm curious, and I've been asked about this, and you may have a little bit more insight defensively, what did you make of how Indiana looked and what takeaways, if any, were there on them on that end of the floor?
Yeah, I think they were really solid overall for how long they've been working together. The defense looked really good. BC Mega didn't shoot the ball well, really, in some parts when they were open. I think part of their poor shooting percentage was in part due to Indiana's really good defense, but they also were just missing some wide open looks, missing a couple of layups. I remember there was one layup, Scoochie Smith. It was just point blank and he just missed it. But I mentioned Parker Stewart before. I think that he was very good on the defensive end, lots of energy. And there was two specific moments that really stuck out to me in the second game that I think really exemplified how developed Indiana already has become on the defensive end. And one of them was that Race Thompson they had done a little bit of switching. Race Thompson was on a guard on the perimeter. Xavier Johnson was fronting someone in the post. Trace Jackson Davis was also at the top of the key on the perimeter. And they forced a missed shot. Xavier Johnson did a great job of denying an entry pass. Race Thompson had a good enough closeout to force the ball handler to make a different decision. He swung it to the top of the key. Trace Jackson Davis makes a timely closeout, and Indiana goes off on the other way. So that was just kind of one little piece of what Indiana was able to do defensively. And then there was another play where Indiana doubles in the post. BC Mega kicks it out, swings it around the perimeter. Indiana continues to get to the perimeter in time, continues to force the extra pass until they finally get to the corner. It leads to a BC Mega drive. Trey Galloway slides in, takes a charge. So, those just kind of two possessions, I think, exemplified how good and impressive Indiana was on the defensive end. They weren't perfect. There was certainly a couple of times where there was wide open dunks and wide open three-pointers. And as I mentioned, BC Mega missed some open looks. But just kind of the intensity and energy overall, I think, really allowed Indiana to be really impressive on that side of the ball.
What did you think of just kind of the competitiveness overall and the level of the game that was being played just from both teams, the energy that they brought? Did it feel comparable to a real game, or did it have more of an exhibition going through the motions feel? It's hard to tell watching the film. You were there. I'm just kind of curious how you felt like both teams maybe approached things and were they taking it maybe, obviously it's a game that doesn't count, but were they approaching it as if it were a game that did mean something?
From the Indiana standpoint, it seemed like they were taking it with the intensity of a game. And I think that's one thing that Mike Woodson and Trace Jackson Davis both said is they've been beating up on each other for the last 2 months. So to have the ability to actually play another opponent, they weren't taking it lightly. They were very excited for that. I think that Indiana just overall had a lot more intensity, a lot more energy than BC Mega. And that's interesting because it feels like a criticism from Indiana's team last year was that they often were flat-footed. There was slow starts because they didn't have enough energy. There was times where they couldn't close the game because maybe their stamina wasn't where it needed to be and they didn't have the focus for the entire 40 minutes. But I think that these two games were kind of a total 180 for that. And Indiana was undoubtedly the team that had had more energy, had more intensity, and you could tell just wanted to be there more. They were just having more fun. Overall, BC and BC Mega was kind of the exact opposite. They didn't really look like they maybe wanted to be there as much. There wasn't really cohesiveness, and you could tell that the guys on Indiana were just having a good time and playing with a lot of energy.
You talked a little bit about Jordan Geronimo earlier, but there's another question here from Foy McNaughton. He says, I think it's fair to say, based on everyone's pre-Bahamas predictions on rotations, that we were sleeping on Jordan Geronimo. What do you feel his impact will be this season?
It's interesting to kind of track what he did these two games because there's no Logan Duncombe and there's no Michael Durr. So the fact that he at 6'6" was able to really compete against guys that were 6'10", with guys that he's like the size of guys that he's likely going to have to make plays against in the Big Ten, I think was very telling. And he did that. He's kind of the epitome of Indiana the entire weekend. He just outworked guys for rebounds. There was one possession in the first game where he had 2 offensive rebounds, keeping the play alive. In the second game, at the end of the first half, he had a stick back as the buzzer went off, where he followed up Trace Jackson Davis's miss. So he was able to bring energy, and like I said before, his confidence from last year was something that I think was pretty apparent. But him just using his athleticism and his explosiveness to his advantage, I think, is what allowed him to kind of set himself apart and make some of the little plays and grab the loose balls, which is something also that Indiana really wasn't able to do last season.
A. Williams wants to know, was there any indication on the guys who missed with injuries having anything serious going on? And I think the answer to that is no, because everything I saw, they all seem to be walking around rather normally. So it seems to be more precautionary, but is that kind of the sense you got as well?
Yeah, I mean, the second game, Logan Duncombe and Anthony Leal were both participating in pregame warmups. So had it been a Big Ten game, a game in February, a game in March, I don't think it would have been too surprising to see them play. We didn't ever see Michael Durr in uniform, but he was walking around. It didn't, at least on the outside, seem like anything too serious.
Matt Weber asks, we saw a passion fire from the on-court guys in highlights. How engaged were they on the bench? And did you notice any difference from previous seasons in terms of just kind of the engagement of the players and their energy level?
I think Miller Kopp was one guy that was very impressive in terms of the energy he brought. I know I noted in the second game, he went out with the ankle injury and he was sitting on the bench with his leg propped up, but you could hear his voice pretty frequently yelling advice, encouragement. I think he's played a huge role. I mean, I think he just fits in really well in terms of skill set and the intangibles that he has to Indiana's team. I mean, he has a lot of experience from Northwestern, but his personality, I talked to him after the first game and he was just saying how much of the energy, like that's just his personality, is that he is trying to bring the best out of the other guys, talk to them constantly. So I think he was a really big part of the energy. And I think Tamar Bates too, especially for a freshman, someone who's just coming in, he looked extremely comfortable in terms of his leadership, his vocal leadership. He brought a ton of energy. There was one play in the second game where it was a loose ball and he went diving on to the base of the scores table and Mike Woodson loved it. But I think that those are two that stick out to me, but it was a collection of people. I think Xavier Johnson was very, very good vocally as well. And the bench too. I mean, there's a lot of energy from the bench. There's guys at timeouts, they'd run out. And I didn't really buy into the thing last season that they didn't have any energy. I think that from being at most of the games, I think they did have pretty good energy. It just didn't always translate to the court. But it was certainly a lot of energy and a lot of intensity coming from the bench.
So I want to wrap up shortly. I got two more things for you. The first is So a week ago today, we're recording this on Tuesday night, but last Tuesday I put out my kind of early prediction of the Big Ten for next season. I had Indiana 8th in my power rankings. I'm sure you saw those. Based on what you saw in the Bahamas, did this look like a team that was better than 8th going into the Big Ten next season? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
I think that if you look at this team as being, this is where they're starting, I think it's very promising, because if all that they were able to do in a couple months, this is the beginning of their overall development. I think that this team is definitely better than eighth in the Big Ten. It is 2 games, but I think that if they can continue to build off of this, and especially just looking at all the growth they made in the 2 months, if they can continue to replicate that month after month after month, I mean, the team could have potential to, I think, be very good. I mean, just off of how short of a time they've been playing together and what they showed throughout the 2 games. And, obviously it's kind of hard to judge BC Mega, how good exactly were they? We haven't seen them really play anybody else, but I mean, kind of from a broad perspective, I think that it was very promising, and that this team, from what they showed the last couple of days, could definitely be, much better than 8th in the conference.
So I mentioned at the top of the show that you're going to be covering football this fall for the Hoosier Network, and I know that they're already in fall camp and everything's going on, so you're kind of jumping in here now and getting going with that. I know you're excited to cover a team that's ranked in the preseason top 25. I know Inside the Hall doesn't cover football, but I did want to give you just an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about what you'll be doing at the Hoosier Network and let people kind of know how to follow that, and just big picture. And what are you looking forward to most about covering the football team this year, and kind of what are you hoping to learn these next couple of weeks as you kind of get ramped up and go into practice and as they head into the first game coming up?
Yeah, my role will be very similar to at Inside the Hall with the Hoosier Network. I'm one of the 2 beat writers for football, and their platform is very similar to Inside the Hall in that it's all online, so it'll allow me to be creative in what I do and pursue different angles of stories. And one thing I'm trying to get out of it too is I don't really have a lot of on-camera experience, and they are more multimedia. They'll do packages and stand-up stuff, so that's one thing that I'm looking forward to getting out of it, and trying to just expand the things that I can do as I try to get a job after graduation. So kind of scary to think about, but that's what I'll be doing. What I'm most excited about, I mean, it's just where the football program stands right now. I mean, just all the optimism around it, just the energy that Tom Allen brings, and just the overall excitement, the way that the program has been trending. I mean, this year is just, it'll be a very kind of intriguing storyline in terms of all the expectations that Indiana has, is something that it probably really hasn't ever had in its recent history. So just seeing how they are able to handle the expectations and just more noise around them, if they're able to live up to and perform up to what people think they're able to do with just more pressure, I think will be very interesting to track.
Well, Tyler, I know you've had a busy couple of days of travel, so thanks for taking the time this evening to answer the questions about the trip. I know people are still really curious about a lot of what went on in the Bahamas, and like I said, I wasn't there, so I can't. I figured it would be better to go directly to the source, the guy that was actually there on the ground. You did a great job with all the content, and it was a lot to juggle. But really good job, and you'll still be around, I'm sure, this fall on occasion doing things here and there for Inside the Hall, and definitely check out what they're doing over at the Hoosier Network, because as we've continued to work with students at Inside the Hall, I think it's very important to support these young people, what they're trying to do, and I like to say the first student that wrote for Inside the Hall is Zach Osterman, and he's someone that you read now all the time at Indy Star. Does a great job. So, I know Tyler's going to go on to be very successful. You're not too close to finding your job yet, though. You still got 2 years. So don't let college go about that. That's my number one piece of advice to you these next 2 years. Enjoy where you are, because there's plenty of people listening to this who would love to trade places with you and be back in Bloomington for 2 more years. So keep doing what you're doing. As far as podcast on the Brink, we're back on a more regular schedule here with the show. Continue to send us feedback that you have on each episode. If there's any guests you'd like us to try to get on, we're always open to suggestions. If you do enjoy the show, leave us a review, a rating on iTunes or Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll be back again soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.